The high-definition security monitors in the executive suite of Horizon Aerospace flared with a sharp amber alert. Vivienne Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer known across the defense industry as the Iron Empress, narrowed her sharp blue eyes at the live feed. It was 3 in the morning. The global launch of the Stratos X, the company's defining autonomous aviation prototype, was less than 72 hours away, and a security breach was the last thing her iron-fisted leadership would tolerate. On the screen, a man in a faded navy blue mechanic uniform was standing inside the restricted hangar bay, leaning deep into the exposed underbelly of the aircraft's experimental cockpit. Vivienne didn't bother calling standard security. She strode down the metallic corridors herself, her signature designer heels clicking with lethal precision against the polished concrete. Accompanying her was Bradley Crawford, the arrogant chief operating officer, who had spent the last year trying to secure his own legacy at the cost of anyone beneath him. When they burst through the pressurized glass doors of Hangar 7, the vast space felt cavernous, smelling of jet fuel, ozone, and cold steel. "Step away from the aircraft immediately," Vivienne commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the heavy cooling fans like a razor blade. The man inside the cockpit didn't flinch or startle. He slowly pulled his upper body out from the open console, holding a worn digital diagnostic tool. This was Garrett Hayes. To the executive board, he was just a quiet 40-year-old single father who worked the grueling graveyard shift, sweeping floors, emptying trash bins, and wiping down grease traps to keep the facility pristine. His uniform was frayed at the cuffs, and his face bore the subtle lines of a man who rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. Yet, as he looked down at Vivienne, his posture remained inexplicably straight, his deep brown eyes carrying an unshakable quiet stillness. "Hayes," Bradley sneered, stepping forward with a malicious smile dancing on his lips. "What exactly does a night shift grease monkey think he's doing touching a $100 million defense asset? Did you think the dark hours gave you the right to play pilot?" "I noticed a severe thermal variance in the secondary avionics bus," Garrett replied. His voice was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of the frantic panic Bradley expected. "The cooling lines were crimped during the afternoon assembly. If your team powers up the main array for the morning test flight, the system will short-circuit and fry the primary navigation boards." Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh, turning to Vivienne. "Hear that? The janitor thinks he's an aerospace engineer now. He probably can't even spell avionics, let alone diagnose a Stratos X system. You've crossed a major line, Hayes. Touching classified military-grade tech without authorization is a federal offense. I'll make sure you leave this facility in handcuffs, and I'll personally guarantee you never get a job washing windshields in this city again." Vivienne watched Garrett closely. Most men in his position would be on their knees, begging for their livelihoods, terrified of impending financial ruin. But Garrett simply stepped down from the maintenance ladder, his movements deliberate, grounded, and perfectly calm. He didn't even look at Bradley. His gaze rested directly on Vivienne, measuring her reaction with a quiet masculinity that made her feel oddly exposed. "My daughter is asleep in the employee break room, Miss Sterling," Garrett said softly, his tone completely steady. "I took this night shift specifically so I could be awake to care for her during the day. I have absolutely no interest in your corporate data. I was simply trying to prevent an accident that would delay your launch." "Don't use your kid as a shield for industrial espionage," Bradley snapped, pulling out his smartphone to summon Federal Security Dispatch. "You're done here, Hayes. Pack your trash and get out of this building before the police arrive to drag you out." Garrett didn't argue. He placed his diagnostic tool neatly on his maintenance cart, wiped his calloused hands with a grease rag, and walked toward the back corridor to retrieve his child. Bradley turned to Vivienne, looking proud of his swift authority. "We should scrub the entire system hard drives immediately, Vivienne." He could have planted a virus or a data skimmer. "These low-level workers will do anything for a payout from our foreign competitors." Vivienne didn't answer right away. She walked over to the cockpit ladder, her eyes fixed on the primary display console Garrett had just been working on. The terminal screen was still glowing with strings of complex data. She climbed the steps, her tailored suit brushing against the metal fuselage, and looked at the diagnostic output. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. The Stratos X project had been plagued by an unbreakable encryption lockout code for 3 consecutive days. Her top MIT-educated software teams had been working around the clock, failing miserably to bypass the system's core algorithmic knot. But right there, blinking in bright green text on the master display, the lockout was completely gone. In its place was a flawlessly executed, single line of elegant override code that had completely stabilized the aircraft's entire main computer network. It was an impossible solution that required an advanced, masterful understanding of experimental military encryption, something a graveyard shift maintenance worker should have found completely incomprehensible. "Who exactly did we just fire, Bradley?" Vivienne murmured, her voice losing its icy controlled exterior for the very first time. Bradley blinked, visibly confused. "What do you mean?" "He's just a nobody. A broke single dad trying to make rent." Vivienne pointed at the glowing screen, her hand trembling slightly with a sudden rush of shock. "Look at the terminal. He didn't break our system. He fixed it. In less than 10 minutes, he did what our entire engineering department couldn't solve in a week." Before Bradley could even process her words, a sudden piercing scream echoed from the far end of the hangar corridor, followed by the terrifying sound of shattering glass. It was the distinct voice of a child in absolute breathless panic. Vivienne sprinted down the corridor, her high heels abandoned somewhere on the cold concrete floor as she raced toward the logistics room. The cold, unyielding corporate mask she wore every day shattered completely with every agonizing second. That wasn't just any child. It was her 7-year-old daughter, Audra, whom she had brought to the office because the nanny had canceled late last night. When Vivienne burst into the room, horror seized her throat. A massive, 600-pound automated metal component rack had suffered a structural failure, toppling forward and slamming against the reinforced glass partition. The glass had shattered into thousands of jagged shards, and the heavy steel frame was pinning Audra beneath its weight. The young girl was trapped in a narrow gap beneath the collapsed steel, her face pale, chest heaving in rapid shallow gasps as she choked on her own terrified tears. "Audra!" Vivienne screamed, throwing herself onto the floor. She grabbed the edge of the freezing steel frame, desperately trying to lift it. The cold metal bit into her manicured hands, tearing her skin, but the massive structure didn't move a single inch. Vivienne's breathing turned frantic. She looked up at Bradley, her eyes wide with a raw, trembling vulnerability that none of her employees had ever witnessed. "Bradley, help me! Lift it!" Bradley stumbled backward, his face drained of color as he looked at the heavy, unstable rack. If I lift it wrong, the whole thing might slide and crush her completely, Vivienne. We need to call the specialized heavy rescue facilities team. It'll take 20, maybe 30 minutes for them to bring the hydraulic jacks from the lower level." 30 minutes? She's suffocating. Vivienne cried out, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. She was a billionaire, a woman who controlled a global aerospace empire. Yet in this moment, all her money and power couldn't lift a piece of iron off her bleeding child. She felt utterly, terrifyingly helpless. "Let me through," a calm, commanding voice resonated behind them. Garrett Hayes stepped into the room. He didn't look at Vivienne's tears, nor did he acknowledge Bradley's panicked stammering. His face was a mask of absolute, unshakable focus. He knelt directly in front of the collapsed structure, assessing the angle of the fall in a fraction of a second. Instead of immediately straining against the weight, Garrett slid closer to the trapped girl. He cleared a path through the shattered glass with his thick leather work gloves, reached his hand under the frame, and gently placed it on Audra's trembling shoulder. "Hey there, sweetheart," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a profound, grounding warmth that instantly cut through the chaos. "My name is Garrett. You're doing a wonderful job staying still. I need you to look right at my eyes, okay? Just look at me." Audra, who had been hyperventilating and screaming in agony, suddenly locked her tear-filled eyes onto Garrett's face. The sheer, steady peace radiating from this stranger seemed to act like an emotional anchor. Her frantic crying slowed down to a rhythmic sob. "That's it," Garrett whispered, his smile gentle and reassuring. "Take a deep, slow breath for me. I'm going to lift this block off you, and when I do, I want you to slide out toward your mommy. Can you do that for me, brave girl?" Audra nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving his. Vivienne watched in absolute awe. She had spent a fortune on the finest behavioral therapists to manage Audra's severe anxiety spikes. Yet this quiet man in a stained uniform had completely stabilized her daughter's panic within seconds using nothing but his presence. Garrett stood up, stepping toward the primary stress point of the steel rack. He didn't look like a man about to perform a standard lifting maneuver. He positioned his body with flawless physical precision, his weight shifting in a way that suggested deep, instinctual training in high-pressure survival scenarios. With a sharp exhale, he gripped the core support beam. The muscles in his forearms and back rippled beneath the frayed fabric of his uniform, veins straining against his weathered skin. With a low, powerful grunt, Garrett hoisted the massive steel structure upward, creating a clean 8-inch clearance. "Now," Garrett commanded quietly, holding the immense, crushing weight entirely on his shoulders. Vivienne didn't hesitate. She reached under the frame, grabbed Audra, and pulled her safely into her arms, pulling back just as Garrett carefully lowered the heavy rack back to the floor. The metal slammed down with a deafening thud, vibrating through the concrete. Audra clung desperately to her mother, burying her face in Vivienne's neck. Vivienne rocked her daughter, her body shaking with residual adrenaline. She looked up to thank Garrett, but the single father had already knelt back down to check the structural integrity of the remaining shelving, ensuring no further collapse would occur. As Garrett turned his arm, the sleeve of his uniform pulled back slightly, exposing a deep, jagged 5-inch scar on his inner forearm. Vivienne's breath hitched. She recognized that specific pattern of scarring. It was a highly distinctive medical graft mark left only by the emergency ejection systems of experimental military fighter jets. Before Vivienne could utter a word, Bradley stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly as he straightened his expensive tie, trying to reclaim his shattered authority. "Well, it looks like a major disaster was averted," Bradley muttered, looking down his nose at Garrett. "You got lucky, Hayes. But don't think this changes the fact that you were caught sabotaging our flagship prototype earlier. Security is still on their way to escort you off the property." Garrett simply stood up, wiped the dust from his knees, and looked at Bradley with a cold, piercing intensity that made the arrogant executive step back in sudden fear. Garrett didn't say a word to him. He turned his gaze to Vivienne, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at the safe child. "She needs some warm water and a quiet space, Miss Sterling," Garrett said softly. "Have a good night." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Vivienne holding her daughter in the quiet wreckage. Her mind was racing frantically. The impossible override code on the terminal, the elite physical crisis response, and the undeniable military ejection scar on his arm. Who was Garrett Hayes really? And what was a man like him doing sweeping her floors? The morning sun had barely begun to pierce through the massive glass facade of the Horizon Aerospace's headquarters, when the main boardroom erupted into a chaotic storm of raised voices. The top 15 software engineers and defense consultants in the country were gathered around the mahogany conference table, surrounded by holographic projections of the Stratos X schematics. At the head of the table sat Vivienne Sterling, her expression unreadable, her hands tightly clasped. Next to her, Bradley Crawford was pacing aggressively, gesturing wildly at the presentation screens. "We have a rogue element within the facility," Bradley declared, his voice echoing off the soundproof walls. The night shift janitor, Garrett Hayes, was caught red-handed altering the core flight control system. "I have already contacted the Federal Aviation Defense Grid authorities. This man needs to be interrogated immediately. We are looking at a total compromise of our intellectual property just 48 hours before our global demonstration." The lead propulsion engineer, an elderly, highly respected scientist named Dr. Eris Thorne, frowned as he adjusted his glasses. He brought up the specific terminal log that Vivienne had saved from Hangar 7. "Bradley, shut up for a second and look at this matrix, Doctor," Thorne commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "This isn't a compromise. Look at the variable integration. Look at how the cryptographic sequence bypasses the secondary throttle lag." "What are you talking about, Eris?" Bradley snapped, crossing his arms. "It's random junk input by a disgruntled maintenance worker." "This is not random," Dr. Thorne whispered, leaning so close to the screen his breath fogged the glass. "This is the Vance Standard Architecture. It's an elite, military-grade development language that was classified by the Pentagon nearly 10 years ago. Only 3 people in the entire world have the clearance and the mathematical genius to write a patch like this. The man who wrote this didn't sabotage the Stratos X. He saved it from a catastrophic thruster lock during transition flight. If we run the simulation with this patch, the stability index hits 100%. Vivienne leaned forward, her chest tightening. "Who wrote that architecture, Eris? Give me a name." Dr. Thorne slowly took off his glasses, looking at Vivienne with absolute seriousness. The primary architect was a legendary Ghost Squadron test pilot and defense engineer, a man who single-handedly designed the automated stabilization systems for the Black Hawk stealth variants before completely vanishing from the radar after a classified incident in the Pacific. His name was Captain Garrett Hayes. The boardroom fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Bradley's mouth hung open, his face turning an unsightly shade of gray as he tried to process the information. Vivienne stood up slowly, the pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together in her mind. The unshakable calm, the flawless physical precision during the rescue, the military aircraft ejection scar on his arm, and the quiet masculinity that refused to bow to Bradley's arrogant threats. He wasn't a janitor. He was an aviation legend hiding in plain sight, sweeping her floors. "Cancel the security dispatch, Bradley," Vivienne ordered, her voice dropping to a dangerous low register. If a single hand touches him on this property, you are fired before the sun finishes rising. Vivienne turned on her heel and walked out of the boardroom, her mind racing with 100 unanswered questions. She bypassed the executive elevators and descended straight toward the lower-level employee facilities. She needed to find him before he walked out of her life and her company forever. Behind her, her daughter Audra trotted quietly, refusing to leave her mother's side after the terrifying incident in the logistics room. When Vivienne pushed open the heavy steel door of the baseline maintenance locker room, the air smelled of industrial detergent and old metal. Sitting on a wooden bench at the very back of the room was Garrett. He had already changed out of his Horizon Aerospace uniform into a simple faded gray t-shirt and dark jeans. Beside him sat a small, 8-year-old girl with bright, intelligent green eyes and neatly braided hair. This was Chloe, his daughter. Garrett was patiently tying the young girl's worn sneakers, his massive, calloused hands moving with incredible gentleness. He was speaking to her in a soft, rhythmic tone that completely contrasted the harsh, high-pressure world Vivienne ruled. "Are we going to the library today, Daddy?" Chloe asked, her voice clean and filled with absolute trust. "We sure are, sweetheart," Garrett replied, smiling gently as he tapped her nose. "We're going to get those books on astronomy you wanted, and then we're going to find a new adventure." "Daddy, look," Chloe whispered, pointing toward the doorway. Garrett stood up smoothly, his protective instincts immediately taking over, as he placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, shifting his body slightly to shield her. He looked at Vivienne, his face returning to that calm, guarded neutrality. "Miss Sterling," he said simply, "my personal belongings are packed. We were just leaving." Vivienne took a step into the locker room, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at the small girl, then back at the man who had saved both her flagship aircraft and her child in a single night. "Mr. Hayes, or should I say Captain Hayes? I know who you are. I know what you did to the Stratos X Core code, and I know what you sacrificed 10 years ago." Garrett's eyes narrowed just a fraction, a sudden dangerous steel flashing within them before quickly fading back into exhaustion. "That life belongs to a dead man, Miss Sterling. Right now I am just a father trying to make sure my daughter has a quiet, safe place to grow up. The defense industry has nothing left for me." Before Vivienne could offer an apology or an explanation, the heavy locker room doors slammed open with a violent crash. Bradley Crawford marched into the small room, accompanied by 3 burly campus guards, and 2 men wearing sharp black suits with Federal Defense Intelligence badges pinned to their lapels. "Right there," Bradley shouted, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Garrett's chest. "That's the man who breached our secure network. Officers, arrest him immediately for corporate espionage and theft of military property." Bradley Crawford stepped further into the locker room, his chest puffed out with an ugly, triumphant smirk. Behind him, Special Agent Jameson Burke of the Federal Defense Intelligence Grid adjusted his dark coat, his face completely devoid of emotion as he looked at Garrett Hayes. The campus security guards stood flanking the narrow exit, their hands resting heavily on their utility belts. The small, enclosed space suddenly felt suffocating, filled with the scent of intimidation and corporate malice. "Stand down, Bradley," Vivienne commanded, her voice cutting through the tension as she stepped between the guards and Garrett. "I am the chief executive officer of this company, and I did not authorize this intervention. You are completely overstepping your bounds. With all due respect, Vivienne, the Defense Board authorized my emergency oversight 6 months ago when we signed the federal launch clauses," Bradley countered, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "When a low-level janitor breaches a classified military-grade autonomous aviation prototype, it completely bypasses your personal feelings. This man is a threat to national security. He's a fraud, a thief, and a failure who's using his position to siphon our tech." Chloe tightened her grip on Garrett's t-shirt, burying her face into his side as a tiny, terrified sob escaped her lips. She didn't understand the complex corporate politics, but she understood the raw hostility directed at her father. She looked up at Bradley with wide, tear-filled green eyes, her small body trembling uncontrollably. "Please don't take my daddy," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with an agonizing innocence that made Vivienne's chest tighten with a sudden, painful pang of empathy. "He didn't do anything wrong. He's a good man. He just cleans the floors." Bradley let out a sharp, mocking chuckle, looking down at the young girl with utter disdain. "He cleans the floors because he's a pathetic loser who couldn't keep a real job, little girl. Your daddy is a criminal. He's going to spend a very long time in a dark cell, and you're going to end up exactly where he found you, in a state facility. He ruined his life, and now he's ruined yours." Vivienne felt a visceral wave of fury crash through her. "Bradley, shut your mouth," she hissed, her hands clenching into tight fists. But Garrett didn't explode in anger. He didn't yell, and he didn't make a single threat. His calm, grounded masculinity remained absolutely unshakable. He slowly knelt down on the cold locker room floor, completely ignoring Bradley, the federal agents, and the surrounding guards. He wrapped his large, strong arms entirely around Chloe, pulling her into a protective embrace that shielded her completely from the toxic environment. "Look at me, Chloe," Garrett whispered, his voice incredibly steady, warm, and filled with a profound, quiet strength that instantly seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "Remember what we talked about? The storm can scream all it wants, but the mountain never moves. I need you to be my little mountain right now. Can you do that for me?" Chloe looked into her father's calm brown eyes, seeing absolutely no fear within them. The utter security radiating from him worked instantly. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand, and nodded bravely. "I can be a mountain, Daddy." "Good girl," Garrett smiled gently, kissing her forehead before standing back up to his full height. He turned to face Special Agent Jameson Burke, his posture perfectly straight, carrying the unmistakable aura of a seasoned military officer who had faced down actual war zones. "If you have a warrant for my arrest, Agent Burke, present it. If not, step away from my daughter." Agent Burke opened his mouth to speak, but before a single syllable could form, the overhead lights in the locker room suddenly flashed a violent, blinding red. A deafening, synchronized siren began to wail through the facility's heavy ventilation shafts. The high-pitched screeching was followed by an automated, synthesized emergency voice that echoed across the entire lower level from the main PA speakers. "Warning. Catastrophic thermal variance detected in Hangar 7. The Stratos X prototype core propulsion cooling valves have suffered an automated lockdown failure. Internal pressure in the secondary lithium-ion array is rising exponentially. Complete thermal runaway is imminent. Total facility evacuation is ordered immediately. T-4 minutes to critical structural blast." The campus guards immediately panicked, turning on their heels and sprinting toward the emergency stairwells without a second thought. Bradley's smug expression dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped his phone onto the concrete floor, his knees shaking violently as he looked toward the corridor. "Thermal runaway?" Bradley stammered, his voice turning into a high-pitched, frantic shriek. "If that core explodes, it'll level this entire 5-block radius. It'll vaporize everything." Without looking back, Bradley shoved past Agent Burke and fled down the hallway, screaming for the elevators in an absolute, cowardly frenzy. Agent Burke and his partner exchanged a look of pure panic before turning to follow the fleeing executive, abandoning their arrest entirely to save their own skins. The wailing sirens grew louder, the red emergency lights painting the metallic walls in a horrific bloody hue. Vivienne stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat as she looked at her daughter Audra, who was now crying and clinging to her waist. Vivienne was a powerful billionaire, a woman who commanded thousands of employees. But as the countdown echoed over the speakers, she felt completely paralyzed by the impending doom. "We have to go," Vivienne choked out, her hands trembling violently as she tried to lift Audra. "The security systems are locked down. The main doors won't open manually. We're trapped." Garrett didn't waste a single fraction of a second. He stepped forward, his calm strength cutting through Vivienne's paralyzing fear like a beacon. He gently took Chloe's hand and placed it into Vivienne's grasp. "Miss Sterling, take both of the girls and head directly down the auxiliary maintenance tunnel through that door," Garrett instructed, his voice carrying an absolute authoritative command that Vivienne found herself instantly obeying. "It bypasses the main security grid and leads directly to the western perimeter fence. The gates there are completely mechanical. You'll be safe. What about you?" Vivienne gasped, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at him. "Where are you going?" Garrett looked toward the heavy blast doors that led directly back into the burning heart of Hangar 7. "The master cooling valves didn't fail because of a technical glitch, Miss Sterling," Garrett said, his eyes turning cold as steel. "Someone manually overrode the safety protocols from an executive terminal to force this crisis. If I don't go into that core room right now and manually bleed the pressure lines, none of us are going to make it to the perimeter fence." The thick, pressurized blast doors of Hangar 7 hissed open, releasing a wave of scorching, superheated air that smelled heavily of scorched lithium and ozone. The entire hangar was bathed in a rhythmic, violent crimson glow from the emergency beacons. In the center of the massive room, the Stratos X prototype was violently vibrating on its hydraulic landing gear, its secondary propulsion housing venting thick plumes of white, pressurized vapor. The digital countdown on the primary hangar wall was ticking down mercilessly. 2 minutes and 45 seconds remain. Vivienne Sterling pushed the heavy mechanical door of the auxiliary safety tunnel open. her heart hammering against her ribs as she guided Chloe and Audra into the reinforced concrete corridor. The tunnel was cool, dark, and led directly to the outer perimeter fence just as Garrett had promised. "Stay here, both of you," Vivienne said, her voice trembling as she knelt before the two young girls. She looked into Chloe's wide, green eyes, seeing the quiet resilience the little girl had inherited from her father. "Hold your sister's hand. Do not move from this corridor until I come back for you." "You're going back for him, aren't you?" Chloe asked softly. She didn't cry. Her tiny voice possessed an unshakable certainty that struck Vivienne to her core. "My daddy doesn't run away when people are in danger. He always stays." Vivienne swallowed the lump of fear in her throat and managed a tight nod. "I won't let him face it alone, Chloe. I promise." Vivienne slammed the heavy safety door shut, locking the children inside the secure bunker line, and turned back toward the burning heart of the hangar. She didn't flee toward the exits like Bradley Crawford or the federal agents. She couldn't. The realization of what her corporate greed and blind trust in executives like Bradley had caused was a crushing weight in her chest. She raced into the hangar control booth, overlooking the flight deck, her bare feet stinging against the debris-strewn floor as she threw herself at the master telemetry console. On the high-resolution tracking screens, she saw Garrett. He was climbing the towering, skeletal scaffolding surrounding the vibrating aircraft. The structural integrity of the metal platform was already failing, warping under the intense, radiating heat generated by the runaway battery array. Garrett moved with zero hesitation, his balance flawless, his steps calculated and rapid. He didn't look like a night shift janitor trying to survive. He looked like a combat commander navigating a collapsing war zone. Through the overhead comms system, Vivienne smashed the override button. "Garrett, can you hear me? The secondary pressure valves are completely locked from the master server grid." Bradley used an administrative encryption lock from his office terminal before he fled. "You can't release them from the manual lever." Garrett reached the top platform, the intense heat singing the fabric of his t-shirt. He wiped the sweat from his eyes with his forearm. His gaze locked onto the glowing mechanical pressure housing of the aircraft. He didn't panic at the mention of Bradley's betrayal. He used a standard corporate lockout protocol. Garrett's voice crackled through Vivienne's headset, perfectly calm, deep and steady despite the wailing sirens around him. He forgot that the mechanical overrides on this specific turbine framework bypassed the digital architecture entirely. "I know because I wrote the baseline physical blueprint for this engine assembly 12 years ago." Vivienne watched in absolute awe as Garrett reached into his back pocket and pulled out a simple, heavy-duty adjustable wrench. The very tool Bradley had mocked him for carrying. Garrett didn't slam the tool against the valve. He positioned himself precisely at the base of the secondary fuel manifold, inserting the wrench into a hidden, unpainted structural notch that wasn't listed on any of the official Horizon Aerospace schematics. With a powerful, synchronized heave of his shoulders, Garrett twisted the hidden mechanical block. The metal squealed in protest, a shower of bright sparks erupting from the housing as the internal gears forced their way open. A massive, deafening hiss echoed through the hangar as a torrent of superheated white steam erupted from the safety vents, instantly dropping the internal core temperature of the battery array by 40% on Vivienne's monitoring screens. The digital countdown clock abruptly paused its rapid descent, freezing at exactly 1 minute and 12 seconds. "The thermal runaway is stabilizing," Vivienne gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears of pure relief spilled over her cheeks. "You did it, Garrett. You stopped the blast." "Not yet." Garrett's voice came through, tighter this time, strained under immense physical exertion. "The primary fuel valve is clear, but the automated terminal is trying to re-engage the lockdown sequence. Bradley's terminal script is looping. It's forcing the main cooling lines to close again. If the lines close while the pressure is this high, the entire manifold will fracture. I have to hold the physical manual lever down until the main power grid completely cycles off." Vivienne's eyes flew back to her console. The primary power grid shutoff switch was located on the far side of the hangar floor, directly beneath the vibrating underbelly of the aircraft. The area was currently being flooded with dense, toxic white vapor from the pressure bleed. It was a blind zone, completely filled with lethal gas and melting metal components. "Garrett, if you hold that lever, you'll be trapped up there when the residual backup system vents." Vivienne screamed into the microphone. "You have to drop it and get out now." "I'm not dropping it, Vivienne," Garrett replied softly, using her first name for the very first time. His voice carried a quiet masculinity that was entirely absolute. "If I let go, this hangar collapses, and the safety tunnel where our daughters are hiding won't hold against the structural cave-in. Cycle the main power grid from the lower floor manual switch, now." Vivienne didn't hesitate. She threw open the control booth door and sprinted down the metallic steps, plunging directly into the thick, blinding fog of the hangar floor. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The air was thick, suffocating, burning her lungs with every frantic breath. She stumbled over discarded tools and heavy cables, guiding herself entirely by memory toward the main power breaker panel. She collapsed against the heavy steel breaker housing, her fingers desperately searching for the massive manual lever. Her hands found the cold iron handle. She threw her entire body weight into it, pulling the lever down with a violent, metallic crash. The entire hangar instantly fell into pitch-black darkness as the primary electrical grid died. The deafening wail of the sirens cut out, replaced by a sudden, heavy and terrifying silence. Vivienne lay on the cold concrete floor, her chest heaving as she tried to breathe through the clearing smoke. "Garrett?" She called out into the darkness, her voice breaking with a raw, desperate terror. "Garrett, answer me!" No sound returned from the upper platform. Only the dripping of hot oil and the ticking of cooling metal echoed through the blacked-out hangar. A low, auxiliary battery-powered emergency light flickered to life, casting long, pale blue shadows across the smoke-choked flight deck of Hangar 7. Vivienne stumbled forward, her voice hoarse as she screamed Garrett's name into the gloom. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the lower tier of the scaffolding. Out of the dissipating cloud of superheated vapor, a tall, silhouetted figure emerged. Garrett walked out into the dim light, his face streaked with grease and sweat, his movements slow but entirely steady. He was carrying his adjustable wrench in one hand, his breathing heavy but completely controlled. "The system is completely inert," Garrett said, his deep voice cutting through the ringing silence. "The cooling lines are open, and the core has dropped back to baseline temperature. The aircraft is safe." Vivienne didn't care about the aircraft. She threw her arms around him in a brief, fierce moment of pure gratitude before pulling back, her face flushed. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's get our daughters." 4 hours later, the main exhibition pavilion of Horizon Aerospace was packed to absolute capacity. Brilliant morning sunlight poured through the massive glass skylights, illuminating the pristine, fully stabilized Stratos X aircraft sitting proudly on a raised obsidian presentation platform. Over 300 high-ranking military officials, global defense contractors, and the entire board of directors were seated in tiered rows, murmuring in anticipation of the global unveiling. At the center podium stood Bradley Crawford. He had spent the morning meticulously adjusting his tailored Italian suit, his previous night's cowardice completely erased from his smug face as he addressed the elite crowd through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Pentagon Oversight Committee," Bradley announced, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "Yesterday we faced a minor localized thermal anomaly during our final diagnostic run. However, due to the swift, decisive crisis management protocols authorized directly from my office, the situation was completely neutralized. Horizon Aerospace doesn't just build the future, we protect it. We are fully prepared to demonstrate the absolute stability of the Stratos X platform." A wave of polite applause rippled through the distinguished crowd. Bradley smiled warmly, basking in the glory, fully prepared to secure his promotion to global director by evening. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the pavilion swung open. Vivienne Sterling marched down the center aisle, her posture commanding, her eyes carrying a lethal, icy sharpness that made the board members near the front row instantly straighten. Walking directly beside her, dressed in a clean dark charcoal button-down shirt and simple slacks, was Garrett Hayes. He held his daughter Chloe's hand tightly in his left, his expression completely calm, radiating a powerful, quiet masculinity that drew every eye in the room. Bradley's smile froze on his face. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edges of the podium, his voice cracking slightly over the microphone. "Miss Sterling, this is a restricted international defense briefing. Why have you brought a terminated baseline maintenance worker and his child into this pavilion? Security, please escort these individuals out of the secure zone immediately." Before the campus guards could move a single inch, a tall, heavily decorated military officer in a pristine uniform stood up from the very front row. This was General Carlton Briggs, the legendary 4-star commander of the United States Advanced Aviation Combat Command, and the primary decision-maker for the entire multi-billion-dollar defense contract. General Briggs didn't look at Bradley. He didn't look at Vivienne. His piercing eyes were locked entirely on Garrett Hayes. The seasoned general went completely pale, his chest heaving with a sudden, overwhelming shock as he stepped out into the aisle. General Briggs stood completely rigid, his eyes welling with a rare, profound emotion. He snapped his right hand up to his brow, executing the most precise, reverent military salute the crowd had ever seen. The 7 high-ranking Pentagon officials sitting behind the general instantly stood up in unison, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor as they all snapped into identical, perfectly crisp, military salutes, honoring the man standing at the back of the room. The entire pavilion fell into a suffocating, bewildered silence. The board of directors stared in utter disbelief. Bradley Crawford's jaw dropped so low his microphone picked up the sound of his frantic, shallow breathing. General Briggs walked down the aisle, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of Garrett. He lowered his salute, his voice trembling with an immense, deep respect that echoed off the high walls. "We thought we lost you in the Pacific 10 years ago, sir. The Pentagon put up a memorial wall in your honor. You are the finest combat pilot and aviation engineer this country has ever produced. What on earth are you doing in a commercial defense facility?" Garrett slowly raised his hand, returning the salute with a quiet, flawless, military precision that proved his identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. "I was raising my daughter," General Garrett replied softly, his voice carrying an unshakable weight that commanded the absolute attention of every billionaire and politician in the room. "I wanted her to have a quiet life, away from the smoke of the testing fields. I took a job cleaning the floors here because it allowed me to be a full-time father during the day." Bradley Crawford stumbled backward off the presentation platform, his face turning an unsightly, ghostly shade of white as the horrifying reality crashed down upon him. The man he had called a broke loser, the man he had threatened to throw into a federal cell, the man he had tried to humiliate in front of his child, was a highly decorated military legend, whom the entire Pentagon revered as an untouchable god of aviation. Vivienne walked up to the podium, calmly removing the microphone from the stand. She turned her gaze to the crowd, her voice cold and unyielding as she locked her eyes directly onto the trembling CEO. "Last night, our flagship prototype suffered a deliberate, malicious safety override intended to force a catastrophic explosion," Vivienne announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority. While certain executives fled the facility in a coward's panic to save their own skin, Captain Garrett Hayes walked directly into a superheated core to manually save this entire city. And he did so after this company completely failed to recognize his worth. The crowd erupted into a chaotic storm of furious whispers and stunned gasps, their eyes darting between the legendary pilot and the disgraced executive. Bradley looked around wildly, finding absolutely no allies left in the room as General Briggs turned a cold, lethal glare directly toward him. General Briggs didn't wait for Vivienne to issue the order. He turned his head slightly toward the 2 armed military officers standing at the entrance of the pavilion. "Escort Mr. Crawford out of this building immediately," the general commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, low-frequency anger. "And contact the Federal Defense Bureau. Tell them I am personally initiating a full-scale espionage and sabotage investigation into every terminal log tied to his credentials." Bradley's face contorted into a mask of pure weeping desperation. "Wait, General, please. It was a misinterpretation. I was trying to protect the asset. Vivienne, you can't let them do this. I've given 10 years to Horizon Aerospace," he shrieked as the 2 towering military MPs grabbed him by his arms, lifting his feet completely off the polished floor. His expensive leather shoes scuffed uselessly against the obsidian presentation platform as they dragged him out through the side doors. His pathetic, echoey pleas quickly faded into nothingness as the heavy doors clicked shut. Vivienne turned back to the remaining board of directors, her gaze scanning the row of wealthy investors who had spent months demanding her resignation over the minor technical delays. "If any of you have a single objection to the immediate termination of Bradley Crawford, or the complete restructuring of our security protocols under Captain Hayes's absolute authority, stand up right now," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. Not a single board member moved. Several of them lowered their eyes, completely unable to look her in the face. General Briggs walked up to Garrett, his weathered face softening as he looked down at little Chloe, who was still holding her father's hand with immense pride. "Captain, the advanced defense grid needs you. The Stratos X is a masterpiece, but without your stabilized architecture, it's just a paperweight. Come back to Washington. Name your price. The Pentagon will build an entire research division around your parameters." Garrett looked down at Chloe, his hand gently squeezing her small fingers. Then he looked at the massive, gleaming autonomous aircraft sitting on the platform. The silence in the pavilion stretched, every billionaire and high-ranking official holding their breath, waiting for the savior of the aerospace industry to claim his ultimate reward. "Thank you, General," Garrett said softly, his voice echoing with that familiar, grounded warmth. "But my primary assignment for the rest of my life is standing right here. My daughter needs a father who is home for dinner. not a commander buried in a classified bunker 3,000 miles away. I left that world behind to protect her peace, and I won't trade her childhood for a budget line in a defense contract. A collective murmur of stunned, deeply humbled respect swept through the crowd. These were people who lived and died by corporate advancement. Yet this man had just turned down the most powerful military appointment in the country without a single hint of regret. Vivienne felt something profound shift deep within her chest. She had spent her entire adult life believing that absolute power, staggering wealth, and corporate domination were the only shields capable of protecting her and her daughter from the cruelty of the world. But looking at Garrett, she realized that true strength wasn't found in a billion-dollar stock portfolio or a ruthless executive title. It was found in this man's quiet masculinity, an unyielding, protective force that gave safety to everyone around him without demanding a single thing in return. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Garrett's with a rare, genuine softness that completely bypassed her professional armor. "General Briggs, Captain Hayes won't be moving to Washington," Vivienne announced, her voice carrying a clear, absolute certainty. "Because as of this morning, Horizon Aerospace is creating an entirely new executive branch. We are establishing the Department of Humanitarian Aviation Engineering. Captain Hayes will serve as the chief director, with absolute veto power over every single defense project we develop. He will choose his own hours. He will work exclusively from this facility, and his office will include a fully staffed, state-of-the-art early education center for his daughter and any employee's child." Vivienne looked directly into Garrett's eyes, her heart racing in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate metrics. "If the captain agrees, of course." Garrett studied her face for a long, silent moment. For the first time since they had met in the dark hours of the hangar, he saw past the cold, intimidating mask of the Iron Empress. He saw the vulnerable, deeply protective mother who had been willing to run into a burning hangar floor just to ensure he wasn't left behind. A slow, incredibly handsome smile broke across his weathered face, erasing years of guarded exhaustion. "That, Miss Sterling, is an architecture I can work with," Garrett said softly. An hour later, the chaotic media storm and the military briefings had been moved to the lower conference halls. Vivienne's private executive office on the top floor was entirely quiet, illuminated by the soft amber glow of the late morning sun. The massive glass walls offered a breathtaking view of the runway fields below, but Vivienne wasn't looking at her empire. She was standing near the plush velvet couches at the back of the room, a glass of water trembling slightly in her hand as the residual adrenaline finally began to fade from her body. For the first time in years, her hands were shaking. The terrifying image of her daughter trapped beneath that steel rack, followed by the blinding smoke of the hangar, flashed through her mind. She felt entirely exposed, her carefully constructed walls turning to dust. On the floor, a miracle was happening. Her daughter, Audra, who usually refused to let anyone touch her during her severe anxiety spikes, was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, laughing entirely out loud. She was happily showing Chloe how to build a digital tower on her tablet. Garrett walked over from the executive desk, carrying a small first aid kit he had retrieved from the hallway. He didn't say a word about her trembling hands. He gently took the glass of water from her grip, setting it down on a side table, and knelt directly in front of her. "Let me see your hands, Vivienne," he whispered, his voice low, steady, and incredibly comforting. Vivienne slowly held out her hands. Her palms and fingers were scraped and bleeding from where she had desperately tried to lift the 600-pound steel frame off her child. Garrett opened the kit, pulled out a clean antiseptic wipe, and began gently cleaning the cuts. His massive, calloused hands, which had just ripped apart a military-grade locking valve hours earlier, moved over her skin with an almost impossible gentleness. "You ran back into the smoke," Garrett said softly, his eyes never leaving his work as he applied a soothing ointment to her palms. "Most people would have kept running toward the perimeter. You didn't." "I couldn't leave you," Vivienne choked out, her voice cracking as a single hot tear finally escaped her eye, tracing down her pale cheek. "I have all the money in the world, Garrett. I can buy entire cities. Yet last night I couldn't even save my own daughter from a collapsing shelf. I was entirely helpless. I've spent my whole life building these walls so nobody could ever hurt us again, but inside those walls I'm entirely alone. I have everything. Except peace." Garrett paused his movements. He slowly looked up, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers with a profound, unshakable intensity that seemed to instantly absorb all her pain and fear. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping the tear from her cheek, his touch warm and grounded. "You aren't alone anymore, Vivienne," Garrett whispered, his voice carrying a quiet promise that vibrated deep within her soul. "The walls don't give you safety. The people who stand inside the storm with you do. You don't have to carry the weight of this entire empire by yourself anymore. I'm right here." Vivienne looked at him, her breath hitching as a powerful, undeniable wave of emotional chemistry flared between them. It wasn't a forced corporate romance. It was the raw, instinctual recognition of two broken single parents who had finally found their anchor in each other. She leaned into his touch slightly, her hand resting against his strong forearm, right over the jagged military scar. For the very first time in her life, the Iron Empress felt entirely safe. Before either of them could say another word, the sharp chime of Vivienne's private desk console shattered the silence. The emergency security frequency began to flash a violent blue light, indicating a highly classified, high-priority transmission from the orbital defense grid was incoming. Vivienne stepped over to her master desk console, her fingers tapping the glowing glass interface to accept the high-priority orbital defense grid transmission. The encrypted projection expanded into the air, revealing the stern face of Director Eleanor Vance of the Federal Cybersecurity Division. Behind her, a massive digital map traced a series of unauthorized data extractions, originating directly from Bradley Crawford's personal laptop terminal, which had been abandoned during his panicked flight from Hangar 7. "Miss Sterling," Director Vance announced, her voice carrying a sharp, professional weight, "the federal forensic teams have just cracked the hidden subsectors of Crawford's hard drives." He wasn't just attempting to delay the launch. He had entered into a multi-million-dollar illicit contract with Vanguard Dynamics, your primary international defense competitor. The thermal runaway sequence he initiated was specifically programmed to mask a massive data siphon. He intended to destroy the Stratos X prototype, bankrupt Horizon Aerospace through structural liability, and sell the foundational blueprints to Vanguard. Vivienne gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "He was going to destroy everything I built." "He would have succeeded," Director Vance continued, a rare admiring smile breaking across her face as she looked toward Garrett, who was now standing directly behind Vivienne. "But Mr. Crawford didn't realize that Captain Hayes's emergency override patch contained a passive, militarized cryptographic tracer. The moment Captain Hayes manually stabilized the cooling valves, his code completely locked down the outgoing data stream, trapped the stolen files in an encrypted loop, and completely exposed every single one of Crawford's offshore banking accounts to the federal treasury. Bradley Crawford isn't just facing corporate termination. He is facing a life sentence for treason, and his entire personal fortune has been legally seized by the state." The projection dissolved into a soft hum, leaving the office in a warm, peaceful silence. Vivienne turned around slowly, looking at Garrett. The final shadow hanging over her empire had been permanently lifted. The man who had entered her building as an invisible, underestimated knight, Janitor, had not only saved her daughter's life and her flagship aircraft, but he had also completely secured the future of her entire legacy. 3 months later, the atmosphere at the Horizon Aerospace campus was entirely unrecognizable. The cold, sterile corporate hierarchy that had once defined the multi-billion-dollar facility had completely dissolved, replaced by a vibrant sense of community and shared purpose. The morning sun cast brilliant, golden beams across the courtyard as hundreds of engineers, technicians, and maintenance workers gathered outside the newly constructed North Wing. The pristine glass building bore a massive, brushed titanium sign that read simply, "The Hayes Department of Humanitarian Aviation Engineering." Directly adjacent to the advanced research laboratories was a beautiful, sunlit courtyard filled with trees, playground structures, and a state-of-the-art early education center. Children of the facility's night shift workers, engineers, and janitors were running through the grass, their laughter echoing through the air that used to smell strictly of cold steel and jet fuel. Vivienne stood at the main podium in front of the massive crowd, wearing a beautifully tailored cream-colored suit, her eyes bright and filled with an unshakable pride. Beside her stood General Briggs, Dr. Eris Thorne, and the entire board of directors, who were all watching the courtyard with profound admiration. "When I took over this company," Vivienne began, her voice carrying through the loudspeakers with a clear, resonant warmth that captivated every single listener, "I measured our success solely through profit margins, defense contracts, and stock values. I believed that power was something you wielded from the top floor, looking down. I was completely blind to the true value of the people who keep our foundations running every single day." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the edge of the crowd, where Garrett was standing quietly, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer over a clean white shirt. He wasn't on the stage. He preferred to remain close to the ground, his humble, quiet masculinity as powerful as ever. Innovation doesn't belong to a specific credential or an expensive executive title, Vivienne continued, her eyes locking onto Garrett's with a deep, public reverence. True greatness is found in the willingness to protect others when the storm is at its worst. Captain Garrett Hayes reminded us that technology must always serve humanity, not the reverse. Because of him, Horizon Aerospace is no longer just a defense company. We are a sanctuary for second chances, for family, and for the quiet heroes who build our future from the shadows. The entire crowd erupted into a massive, deafening roar of applause. Hundreds of employees clapped furiously, many of the maintenance staff cheering with tears of validation in their eyes as they looked at their former colleague. General Briggs stepped forward, leading a formal military salute from the uniform officers in attendance, cementing Garrett's legacy in front of the entire world. As the celebration continued below, Vivienne and Garrett walked up to the private observation deck overlooking the main runway. The Stratos X autonomous aircraft soared into the bright blue sky above, executing a flawless, perfectly stabilized vertical climb that met absolutely zero resistance. Chloe and Audra raced ahead of them, their hands tightly held together as they ran toward the glass railing, pointing up at the aircraft with matching, joyous smiles. The two young girls had become completely inseparable, their friendship bridging the gap between two entirely different worlds. "Are you still having second thoughts about turning down that Washington appointment?" Vivienne asked softly, stepping closer to Garrett as the cool afternoon breeze ruffled her hair. Garrett didn't look at the aircraft. He looked down at Chloe, who was currently laughing as Audra tried to copy her astronomy hand signs. He smiled, a deep, genuine expression of pure peace settling into his features. "None whatsoever," Garrett replied, his voice low, resonant, and entirely steady. "Some architectures matter a whole lot more than software, Vivienne. This is the only runway that matters to me." Vivienne found herself reaching down, her fingers gently sliding into his large, calloused hand. Her grip was tight, secure, and entirely devoid of the professional armor she had worn for so many years. Garrett's fingers closed around hers, his strong, protective warmth enveloping her hand completely. "I'm still learning how to navigate a life that isn't dictated by quarterly corporate reports," Vivienne whispered, looking up into his deep brown eyes with a vulnerable, beautiful smile. Garrett tilted his head, his gaze holding hers with a quiet, powerful certainty that promised an entire lifetime of safety. "And I'm learning that sometimes, standing inside the storm with the right person is the only way to find where you truly belong." As the sun began to set over the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of deep amber and violet, the two single parents stood hand in hand, watching their children play in the light of a completely transformed world. The story of the single father who cleaned the floors and the billionaire CEO who ruled the empire wasn't finished. In many ways, their true design was just beginning.